A promise fulfilled, an overcomplicated origin story, and yes, I do reference The Witcher at one point. I'm Matt, and this is the Spectred Isle. Welcome to the Spectred Isle, a channel dedicated to the myths, mysteries and malcontents that inhabit these great isles of Britain. In several videos in the past, I've made reference to a spectral gang of ghostly hunters led by a variety of characters, from legendary kings to old gods to guys made up by Shakespeare. And every time I promised I would eventually do a video on the topic. Well, prepare to be disappointed, because much like the release of Duke Nukem Forever, the wait is finally over, but it probably won't be as good as you were hoping or expecting, as we discuss the legend of the Wild Hunt. Much like anything else I discuss from a medieval persuasion, as was the case in my Canoenos video, the folklore of the age wasn't restricted to the British Isles, and in fact much of it could be classed as imported in. With the Wild Hunt, the origins can best be described as Germanic, a tribal culture that stretched across Europe, mainly in Scandinavia and of course much of modern Germany, through to the eastern states around Moldova and Ukraine. From the British Isles, Germanic culture came to us via the settlement of the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, though there had been centuries of interaction between Germanic and Celtic tribes before, given their proximity to each other in Europe. This also shows itself through the origins of the Wild Hunt myth, as while German pagan myths see the most prominent and numerous references, stories can also be found within Celtic and even Old Slavic religions. The actual term Wild Hunt is credited to Jacob Grimm, one of the famous brothers Grimm. As well as writing and editing fairy tales, Grimm had an academic interest in linguistics and folklore and wrote the book Deutsche Mythology. The Wild Hunt is one of many folk tales that he views from a comparative mythology perspective, which is the theory that by comparing the similarities of various folklore from differing cultures, you can piece together a common ancestor and get to the heart of the original tale. The 4 volumes of Deutsche Mythology can be found on the Internet Archive in both their original German and translated into English forms for those of you wishing to do some further reading, but I would advise it is a hell of a slog. Grimm did an astonishing amount of research for this 4-volume, 1200-page anthology of folklore, and there are times it feels like 90% of the text is just references to other work, so prepare yourself if you want to dive into it. Grimm is often credited for coining the term Wild Hunt, although there is evidence that folkloric traditions in northern Germany called it as such, while southern Germany went with the much cooler Furious Host or Raging Host. But the first recorded evidence of the Wild Hunt phenomenon can actually be found in English literature. If you remember back in my Black Dogs video, I quoted a passage from the Peterborough version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that seemed to describe the Wild Hunt. The full passage, which I didn't quote in that video because only a bit was about black dogs, is as follows. Many men both saw and heard a great number of huntsmen hunting. The huntsmen were black, huge and hideous, and rode on black horses and black he-goats, and their hounds were jet black, with eyes like saucers and horrible. This was seen in the very deer park of the town of Peterborough, and in all the woods that stretch from that same town to Stamford, and in the night the monks heard them sounding and winding their horns. There are reportedly oral traditions in other Germanic areas that precede the writing of this passage in 1127, but they are just that, oral traditions. It should however be noted, but by this time the Anglo-Saxons were 5 centuries deep into the throes of Christianity. Grimm and other scholars have noted various legends of the hunt that have a very pre-Christian slant to them, in the sense that they're not whining about evil and demons and such, so I do believe that the oral traditions stretch much earlier than this passage. It just so happens that this is the first time someone thought to write it down. Though to be honest, this was the first time someone thought to write it down is basically the back cover quote for the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The comparative mythology one is an interesting angle, and it ties back to something that I've discussed before. Ronald Hutton is a legendary academic folklorist and the first person I look to when researching any British myth topic. In 2014 he released a paper going into the Wild Hunt and how he believes it influenced the more modern tale of the Witches' Sabbath. He spent a lot of time looking into Grimm's work, as well as several other scholars, and spent some time discussing that the Wild Hunt myth itself could be a conflation of older myths around a nocturnal procession of the dead. Without going into too much detail, processions of the dead can also be found throughout the world, most of which feature someone leading the souls of the dead to their final resting place. The Spanish tradition of Santa Compaña has a mortal leading the souls with a candle, but ancient myths from around the world feature something that acts as a shepherd of the dead. Charon, the ferryman in Greek myths, Anubis as a guide of souls in Egyptian myth, and Yama in Hindu myth, who uses the less family-friendly noose to guide souls. So all of these different folkloric ideas of the Wild Hunt seem to have a common ancestor in the form of a death procession, only for that to just be one of several different ideas of the dead being guided in some way. If we were able to follow the leads to a common ancestor for those stories, what else might we uncover? This harkens back to my Big Grey Man of Ben McDooey video, where I admittedly went on a bit of a rant about how dismissive we are of ancient superstitions as just stories. Now who's to say that if we keep following these threads back to older and older origin points, we won't eventually stumble upon the truth? There's a moment in the Sandman comic series where an old Egyptian goddess Bast laments that she no longer has her pick of the offerings and prayers like she used to, a moment that highlights the power of faith and how a god is only as powerful and alive as their congregation is. The fewer people believe, the less real they are. Maybe the veil between life and death was thinner several millennia ago than it is now, back before our collective consciousness chose to believe in science as the answer, or monotheism before that, back when the gods were abundant and magic was real and the dead walked among us all, just because we believed it. But I'll stop there before I go off on another rant, because there's still a lot of Wild Hunt to discuss. As you might expect from a legend with so many regional interpretations, the makeup of the hunting party is quite varied as well. Naturally, the most common theme is that the hunt is spectral in nature. There are ghosts of the dead in many of the tales, which makes sense given what I discussed earlier about potentially stemming from older traditions of death processions. But the ideas range as to what they are ghosts of. In some interpretations, the spirits are specially chosen by the leader of the party, a figure we'll get to later. For example, some of the Scandinavian interpretations that put the leader as Odin claim the hunting party is made up of warriors selected from within the ranks of Valhalla or some of Odin's favoured Valkyries. The specially selected warriors comes up a few times in legends with specific figures as the leader, or just as often whatever happened to the leader that cursed him to be spectral, it also happens to his entourage at the time, you know, like the innocent palace workers in Beauty and the Beast. On the lines of the leader being cursed to his fate, other interpretations state that every member of the party is someone who led a wicked or violent life and is either making comeuppance by hunting the souls of the evil themselves, or has been resigned to the fate of unending, inconclusive hunting as a punishment. Some theories I found claim that the party is made up of the souls of the unbaptized, though others claim unbaptized souls are their quarry instead. Either way, these are clearly Christianized interpretations, trying to convince people to be good boys and girls and get dunked, rather than legitimate ancient superstitions. In some stories, the hunt even swept up random passers-by. Legend says that if you are outside while the hunt is riding, the mass of the party would sweep you up to join in the hunt, whether you wanted to or not, and when they dissipated or flew off or whatever, you'd be left miles from where you started. That being said, another legend says that if you stick your head out of the window to watch the hunt, it will inflate until it's too big to pull back through, and you'll basically be stuck there until the hunt finishes their ride for the night. Other legends say that magicians, witches and wizards were members of the hunt, astrally projecting themselves so their spirits could enjoy the chaos of the hunt while their bodies were safely tucked up in bed. Animals naturally crop up in most stories. Horses are obviously a key one, being the mounts on which the hunters ride, though goats also crop up in that circumstance sometimes. Some Scandinavian ideas also have horses pulling Odin's wagon, which interestingly is also what their culture referred to the Big Dipper constellation as, and since the hunt were claimed to race across the sky in many legends, there's a whole thing there. Dogs and wolves make up part of the hunt as well, understandably given that in real life hunting parties dogs are often used for their speed and ability to track scents across vast distances. Wolves can obviously do that too, but in real life hunting parties I don't think they're as easily placated with the promise of a tennis ball and some sausages. Of course, the Christian influence rears itself again in this part. In areas of the UK, the dogs are alleged to be hellhounds, generally in stories where the leader of the hunt is the devil himself and they are chasing down the souls of sinners, the unbaptized, or escapees from hell. There's also a few British legends about dogs being called dandy dogs, due to being the pets of a man called Dando. Apparently he was a priest and clearly a total legend because he rode into hell just to find alcohol strong enough to satisfy his needs. His dogs chased after him, trying in vain to stay with him, and to this day they can still be heard chasing the scent of their trans-dimensional master. One of the key things to consider when it comes to the wild hunt is this: if they are a hunting party, what exactly are they hunting? Now, this is something that again ranges in interpretations depending on the origin of the hunt story. Look at Scandinavian folklore and they'll tell you it's a hunt for monsters, sometimes a troll, sometimes a ra, which were spirit wardens of places like forests, mountains and rivers, or it was any other form of vaesen, a catch-all old Scandinavian term for supernatural beings and all firm favourites of Odin's for hunting. As mentioned in my Black Dogs video, in the story of Richard Cabell, one of the most common British interpretations is that they hunt nothing. The eternal hunt they find themselves on and the eternal dissatisfaction they face of never actually having a target is punishment for misdeeds they carried out when they were alive, in particular conducting extreme violence towards humans or animals, or taking too much pleasure from said violence. In a lot of the Germanic areas these folktales can be found. When Christianity came along and nudged out the pagan beliefs, the victims of the hunt became human souls, sinners and escapees from the underworld being returned to hell by the devil's own hunting party. When we look at the symbolism of the wild hunt, and indeed the potential meaning behind the folklore, and possibly even the ancient truth, we have to look through two lenses, pre-Christian and post-Christian. This is because many legends from before Christianity started throwing its weight around identify the hunt as not some raiding party or war band, but a procession for a god or goddess visiting their people during a holiday or festival to enjoy celebrations and accept offerings. The festival would usually take place in around April or May, potentially linking in with spring festivals where the gods would bless the people with a bountiful season in thanks of the honour being given to them. It's only after Christianity stepped in that the link to demons and damned souls came about, one of many ways in which the missionaries of the time highlighted that the old gods you worship are all a bunch of evildoers and how totally punished you'll be if you keep idolising them. This also seems to tie in with the transition of the bountiful sunny harvest parade of the gods to the depiction that the hunt rode during winter, particularly the darkest and coldest parts of midwinter, a time of storms and howling winds and longer nights that gave the world a much more ominous feel. There's also the idea that the hunt symbolised the coming of war. I believe this to be from legends unrelated to the They Come Every Winter ones, because even though the Middle Ages were rife with conflict, there wasn't a new war every January. The idea is that when one spotted the hunt, it meant that war would soon come, and as the spectral host grew larger and larger, it signified that the upcoming conflict was getting closer and closer. This could be descended from the idea that the hunt was an offshoot of the procession of the dead myth. Obviously, the local death toll would be much higher at times of war, and so maybe the concept of the hunt evolved from a procession of the dead following a war to the omen of one to come. We've discussed way back in the early days of the channel that ghost armies from significant bloody battles are a thing in folklore, and some of these stories were in areas not yet but soon to be impacted by future wars, so there is that. It could also be a translation error. As I mentioned earlier in this video, one of the Germanic names for the hunt translates to the Furious Host, but some have translated it to mean the Furious Army or similar, potentially leading to a misinterpretation that gives the hunt more of a warband vibe than a hunting party, and thus leading to the symbolism of warfare. Of course, if we go back to the topic of the procession of the dead, it could just be our ancestors' way of coming to terms with death. Much in the way that modern people take comfort thinking their loved ones are looking down on them from heaven, maybe back then, with hunting being such a popular pastime, medieval peasants looked out at some spectral visage in the sky and thought, "Ah, there go da, hooting with the mated like you would want her." Disclaimer, that wasn't actually Old English, it's just kind of what it sounds like to me. One of the main things discussed when the hunt is brought up is who leads it, and there are dozens of ideas from cultures across Europe as to this figure. I've already mentioned the Scandinavian idea that it's Odin, and the equivalent god in Germany, Wotan, and Britain, Woden, shows up in some legends. Although with the Germanic pagan beliefs clearly being an equal opportunity mythology, some interpretations put Wotan's wife Holder at the helm. I said earlier that Richard Cable from the old Dartmoor legend is claimed to be leader as punishment for sinful behaviour, and a few more details about him can be found in my Black Dogs video, so I won't repeat here. Staying in Dartmoor, there is a local legend that Sir Francis Drake, England's heroic explorer and vice admiral against the Spanish Armada, actually gained his reputation through using magic gifted to him by the devil, and he now leads a pack of whist hounds around the area of Wistman's Woods to hunt the souls of the unwary or unbaptized. Apparently there are some thoughts that the leader could be Gwydion, a major character in the Mabinogion, which is a compilation of Welsh stories akin to the Tales of Arthur, which will also be getting at least one video at some stage. However, the only reference to this I was able to find was a book by Emily Lloyd-Jones called The Wild Huntress, and it just seems to be a retelling of the tale with Welsh cycle characters. Sticking with Welsh myth, some legends claim it is Gwyn ap Nudd, a heroic figure who serves as the lord of the Welsh underworld Annan. This shares some striking similarities with our boy Cernunnos, also claimed to be a leader of the Wild Hunt and the Celtic lord of the underworld, and of course the Christianised idea that the hunt is led by the devil himself, the Christian lord of the underworld. Gwyn even has his own version of hellhounds, the Cwn Annan, whose barks apparently sound like honking geese. Gwyn is also claimed to be a king of the fairies in the same sense as Oberon, and sticking with the fairy idea, another thought is that the leader of the hunt is King Hurler. Now, according to Walter Map, a 12th century author, Hurler was a king of the Britons, a name basically given to the British branch of the Celts, and he was tricked by a Fey ruler, often credited as a dwarf, into attending his wedding in Fey. Now, while in Fey, he is gifted a dog that jumps into his saddle, and the king and his men are taught not to alight their horses until the dog jumps down. Hurler and his band go back through the portal to our world, only to discover that 3 days spent in Fey was 300 years in Britain, and the Saxons had now taken over. Some of Hurler's men, in surprise at this, jump from their horses and crumble into dust, as the dog had not jumped down yet. And so Hurler and his host remain as spectral riders, waiting for the dog to leap down so they can be saved. However, one version of Map's book does say that apparently all of the riders jumped into the River Wye in 1154, so maybe they're a different group. In Shakespeare's play The Merry Wives of Windsor, it is noted that a gent called Herne the Hunter stalks the woods of Windsor Forest as a spectre, who is allegedly the forest's previous keeper and haunts one tree, henceforth known as Herne's Oak, and spends his time blowing his horn and rattling his chains, possibly to freak out children. The thing is, there is no record of Herne before Shakespeare's play, though plenty of speculation afterwards has attributed him to the idea of the Wild Hunt. hunt, and Cernunnos, funnily enough, as Herne is described as wearing horns on his head. Some have theorised the name Herne could be derived from Herion, an old title given to Woden. Herla is also suspected to be another name or guise for Woden, and wouldn't you know it, Herne and Herla are quite similar names. Can you see now why Grimm spends so much of his book quoting this little snippet from one thing and that little snippet from another to try and piece them together? There are so many slight details in one legend that makes you think, oh, this ties into another legend. The question is, does each legend inspire a detail in the next, or did they all descend from one overarching true story? Odin or Woden or Wotan or whatever you want to call him crops up in a lot of these, so maybe the real Odin did lead a spectral hunting party back in the day. And yes, I know I said the real Odin, trust me. There's a slew of other theories as to what and who this could be, many of which seem to be somewhat heroes or anti-heroes of their day that must have cropped up around the relevant time. A Saxon fellow called Edrich the Wild who rebelled against the Normans and was allegedly cursed by William the Conqueror. A similar rebel called Hereward the Wake who was basically the Saxon Hercules and may have inspired the stories of Robin Hood. Saint Guthlac, a medieval hermit praised for his pious lifestyle, which seems at odds with the Christian idea of the hunt being evil or demonic spirits, but possibly linked to the idea of chasing down the sinners and the unbaptized to convert them to Christianity. Jan Tregeagle, a Cornish magistrate whose grating personality led to rumours and stories that he had sold his soul to the devil for power and leading the hunt was his punishment after death. And some folk claim it's King Arthur, because at some point you always have to claim a mythological figure as King Arthur. I'm amazed nobody has actually said at this point that the Loch Ness Monster isn't King Arthur. Until now, this point, the Isle of Avalon was in the middle of Loch Ness and Arthur was resurrected as Nessie. There, done. And I had to mention it at some point, so here you go. Another theory is that the Wild Hunt's leader is an elf of the older folk called Eredin, who's pursuing the ancestor of Lara Dorren so he can gain control of the Elder Blood. Happy now, Witcher fans? I'm a Witcher fan too, I'm not taking the piss. So there you go. After multiple videos where I said I would discuss the Wild Hunt, I now have done. And in the process, I also said I'm going to do videos on King Arthur, the Mabinogion, and who knows what else. Though, to be fair, they were always part of the plan. Naturally, it's up to you whether you choose to believe in the Wild Hunt and who leads the charge and what it's made of and who they're hunting and all of those things that we've discussed. But as I always say, a world bereft of magic and mystery is a boring world to live in. Stay safe, stay sane, and have a good one.